Well, this one-year anniversary is also a time to remember the horrors that have been inflicted on Ukrainian civilians, perhaps the best-known example being the town of Bucha, north of Kyiv. And a warning, the images you're about to see are disturbing. Civilians were found shot on the street in Bucha, and mass graves were discovered in April 2022 after occupying Russian forces retreated. Civilians were apparently massacred there. Bucha has since become the scene of international war crimes investigations. Well, DW special correspondent Aya Ibrahim is in Bucha for us. Aya, great to see you. So tell us how Bucha, which witnessed those almost unspeakable images of violence that we've seen, how are they marking this sombre day there?
Well, Pablo, all day today here in Bucha, there have been events commemorating and remembering the victims of Russia's occupation, which lasted a little bit over a month. Where I am right now is a church where one of these commemorative events took place earlier this morning. There was a service in this church, and we are really in a place that was a witness to the horrors that happened here in Bucha during the occupation. Just behind me, sort of in that direction, that is the site of the huge mass grave of civilians that we all know about. And the church has actually become a permanent exhibition. Now, I do want to warn our viewers that some of these images are quite disturbing, but photographers have collected images and put them here in the church, and it's really become a place for people to come not to just pray, but also to remember the tragedy that civilians had to witness here. And there was a lot of rebuilding to be done, and a lot of help that civilians here needed when the town was liberated, and a lot of that work had to be picked up by volunteers. And I'm joined today by someone who was here, one of the first civilians that were actually allowed to come back to Bucha when it was liberated. I'm joined by Lubomir here, who is from Bucha, grew up here, and after he had fled, came back to help the civilians when the town was liberated. So why don't you tell me a little bit about what you saw when you came back to Bucha last year?
When I came back to Bucha, I saw the many crashed cars on the road and military equipment. I saw the destroyed houses, buildings and yards. And it was a very bad picture.
Mm-hmm. And what did the people tell you when you first came here after they had lived for these long weeks under Russian occupation? What did the citizens here tell you?
The citizen was happy to tell someone his stories that they survive, how they survive. Mm-hmm. And they want to speak with someone.
Mm-hmm. And what did they need? Give us an idea about the basic needs that people here had directly after liberation.
After liberation, they need the food, the clothes, the water, and the electricity to charge their phones, to call his family, his friends, and know some news from the world, from Ukraine, from situation in the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And now we're marking a year since the war, since this invasion that has changed this country. As a young Ukrainian, what is your wish for your country moving forward in this coming year?
I want to wish to Bucha and to my country stay strong as they are. I want that Bucha should show that his spirit is unbreakable, just like the spirit of all Ukraine. And I want to tell to everyone that we should never forget what happened here. And we must do everything that we can to stop the enemies of all civilized world.
Thank you. Pablo, back to you.
Aya, before you go, can you tell us just a little bit about what the paths for justice are for the victims in Bucha?
So the path is quite long and complicated. Just to paint a bigger picture of the war crimes that have been committed here in Ukraine, according to the general prosecutor, there have been 70,000 reported alleged war crimes here in Ukraine committed by Russian soldiers. And Ukraine's judicial system has already begun prosecuting some of these cases. So far we have 25 convictions, 25 Russian soldiers who have been convicted of war crimes in Ukraine. Some of them have been tried and convicted in absentia. But if the ones that have been convicted are ever found abroad, they can be extradited. But this will likely take a very long time, and there are other avenues as well. For example, in international law, there is the concept of universal jurisdiction. Some countries, if they find wanted war criminals on their territory, including Germany, they can stand trial in those countries as well. And that's why, for example, you have Syrian war criminals that have stood trial in Germany in the past years. As for leaders, the ones that are, that many argue are actually ultimately responsible for these war crimes, like Vladimir Putin, well, that is more complicated. The International Criminal Court has started an investigation. Russia doesn't really recognize the authority of the ICC, and that's why there are international calls for an international tribunal where eventually these leaders could face justice. But the timeline on these processes are very long. They could take very, very many years. But the prosecutor has vowed that the Ukrainian general prosecutor has vowed that he will pursue every case, no matter how long it takes.
Thanks, Aya. DW Special Correspondent Aya Ibrahim in Bucha for us. Well, joining us from Paris is Alexandra Matvichuk. She's head of the Center for Civil Liberties, an organisation in Kyiv that shared the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize for its work documenting war crimes and human rights abuses. Welcome to DW. So we just heard from a father who lost his family in Bucha. He's one of tens of thousands of Ukrainians seeking justice. Now, with the volume of cases, is that possible?
We face with enormous amount of crimes after large-scale invasion started. And now we are working on the complex justice strategy to be able to provide chance for justice for each victims of this war. It's extremely important because life of each person matters, and we have united efforts to achieve it.
Now, the EU has unveiled what it calls a game-changing data centre to handle evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. Do you see it the same way?
We need the assistance of EU also working on the ground where the crimes are committed daily by Russian soldiers. We need involvement of international investigators, international prosecutors, international detectives, and international judges into national system to make it capable to effectively investigate and prosecute dozens of thousands of criminal proceedings.
Tell us, what kind of crimes are you investigating right now?
Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare, and we document different cases when Russian troops deliberately shell in residential buildings, schools, churches, hospitals, attack evacuation corridors, manage filtration camp systems, organize forcible deportations, commit murders, rapes, tortures, abductions, and other kinds of offenses against civilians.
Certainly a very long list indeed. Now, you said that all war crimes in Ukraine can be traced back to Russian President Vladimir Putin. What proof have you gathered to support that claim?
These numerous crimes, which we document for current moment, was possible because Putin and his surroundings initiated, planning, and started this war of aggression. So we need to punish Putin and the high political leadership and top military command for this kind of crime. And in order to do it, we must create special tribunal and hold them accountable.
Well, in a recent talk, you said sociologists have asked Ukrainians what would be their greatest disappointment after the war ended, and more than 65% said impunity for Russian war crimes. So what kind of justice are people in Ukraine seeking?
Justice which can provide them to return their names. What do I mean? Because when we are in war, the scale of war crimes grows so large that it's impossible to recognize all the stories, and we start to notice how war turned people into the numbers. But people are not numbers, and only justice can return people their names.
Tell us this, how can war crimes committed in Ukraine be prosecuted when many of the accused are actually in Russia or in Russian-controlled territories?
But it's not excuse to delay with appropriate legal proceedings. We cannot wait when the war will end. Justice must be independent of the magnitude of Putin's regime's power, and the history of humankind convincingly prove that sooner or later authoritarian regime collapsed and their leaders, who see themselves untouchable, appeared under the court.
Now, tell us, you tweeted today about your reflections 1 year since Russia invaded Ukraine, and you said that Ukraine is a vivid example that people fighting for freedom and democracy are much stronger than, quote, the second army of the world. Are these ideals enough for Ukraine to win the war?
This is not just a war between two states, it's a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And if authoritarian regime cooperates with each other, democracies have to support each other even more. That's why we ask from international community to provide Ukraine with modern weaponry, modern tanks, modern planes, to be able to defend our people, our democratic choice, and our territory.
Do you see Ukraine as a stronger democracy today than it was before the war?
I see the very deep understanding among the people for what we are fighting for in this war. In this war with Russia, we are fighting for freedom in all senses, for freedom to be an independent state, for freedom to be Ukrainians and not to be forcibly re-educated as Russians, and for freedom to have a chance to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected.
Thank you, Alexandra Matvichuk, the head of the Center for Civil Liberties, an organisation in Kyiv that shared the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize for its work documenting war crimes and human rights abuses.